The story begins before any door is touched, before any sound is made, in the long psychological shadow cast by years of occupation. The knock at dawn is not merely an action but a symbol that has already done its work long before it happens. It exists in memory, in rumor, in the shared understanding of what dawn has come to mean under foreign rule. Morning, once associated with renewal, light, and ordinary routines, has been inverted into the most dangerous hour of the day. Darkness no longer conceals danger, daylight reveals it. People wake before the sun not because they are industrious or hopeful, but because sleep itself has become unsafe. To be awake is to brace oneself, to listen, to count seconds in the quiet and measure one's own breathing against the silence of the street. In occupied homes across Europe, the knock at dawn had acquired a precise and terrifying clarity. It was not loud, dramatic, or chaotic. It did not need to be. Its power lay in its inevitability and its meaning. A sharp, controlled sound against what carried with it the certainty that life would not continue as it had the night before. It meant names on lists, accusations rarely explained, and departures that were final even when they were framed as temporary. People learned not to ask where their neighbors had gone. The absence itself was the answer. Entire communities adapted to this unspoken grammar of fear, where the smallest noises could carry fatal significance. This fear was not abstract or exaggerated, it was learned through repetition. Every household knew someone who had heard that knock. Every street had a memory attached to it. Children learned early to recognize the sound not through explanation but through reaction, through the way adults stiffened, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way hands instinctively moved to hide papers, photographs, or radios. Fear became procedural, a series of actions rehearsed endlessly in the mind. What to grab, what to destroy, what not to say. Dawn transformed into a threshold between safety and loss, and crossing it felt like a test one could never fully prepare for. The narrative situates itself squarely inside this inherited terror. It does not begin with armies advancing or flags being raised, but with ordinary people inside ordinary rooms, waiting. The room itself becomes a vessel for memory. Its walls have absorbed whispers, its furniture has witnessed hurried decisions, its windows have framed both night patrols and empty streets afterward. Silence here is not peaceful, it is vigilant. It is the sound of people listening for footsteps, engines, or voices that might confirm what they already fear. The stillness is taut, stretched thin by expectation. This is the emotional baseline from which everything else will be measured. The title invokes this fear deliberately because it is the language the audience already understands. History has trained us to associate occupation with brutality, authority with force, and entry with violation. The knock at dawn is shorthand for all of it. It represents not only physical danger but moral collapse. The idea that power operates without restraint, that compliance offers no protection, and that innocence is irrelevant. In this world, the knock does not ask, it declares. Yet even as this fear is established, the narrative begins to introduce tension, not through contradiction, but through anticipation. The people inside the room do not know who is on the other side of the door. They only know what history has taught them to expect. This uncertainty is crucial. The story does not deny the reality of past terror, it relies on it. The audience is meant to feel the same tightening in the chest, the same instinctive assumption that whatever comes next will confirm the pattern. This is how moral reversal gains its force, not by erasing what came before, but by confronting it directly. The knock at dawn, feared for so long, has shaped behavior even in its absence. People rehearse disaster so often that it becomes part of their identity. They do not need to hear the sound to feel its presence. This is how occupation extends beyond soldiers and checkpoints. It rewires the inner lives of those who endure it. The story lingers here, emphasizing that the greatest damage of oppression is not always visible. It lives in anticipation, in reflex, in the way people interpret silence as threat rather than relief. By anchoring the opening chapter in this psychological landscape, the narrative frames the coming moment as something more than a military encounter. It is a confrontation between expectation and reality, between learned fear and an outcome not yet revealed. The title's phrasing, "They feared the knock at dawn," is not passive description. It is an acknowledgement of a shared condition, one that defines the emotional stakes of everything that follows. The fear is rational, earned, and deeply embedded. Nothing about it is naive. This chapter, therefore, does not rush toward resolution. It refuses to reassure. Instead, it asks the viewer to sit inside the fear long enough to understand its weight. It reminds us that liberation, when it comes, does not arrive into a neutral space. It enters rooms already crowded with memory, rooms where silence has been weaponized by experience. The door stands as a boundary between past and future, but the people inside cannot know that yet. For them, it is simply a door, and behind it, the accumulated thread of years. The moral power of the story begins here, in the recognition that fear does not require new violence to sustain itself. It only needs continuity. The knock at dawn is terrifying not because of the sound it makes, but because of what it has always meant. This chapter establishes that meaning with deliberate care, ensuring that when the pattern breaks, it will not feel accidental or trivial. It will feel seismic. In this way, the opening does not merely describe fear, it honors it as historical evidence. Fear becomes testimony. It tells us what life under occupation was like without listing atrocities or statistics. It tells us through atmosphere, through routine, through the way mourning itself became an enemy. And it leaves us there, inside the room, in the seconds before the sound that has already defined their lives is expected to arrive once again. When the moment finally arrives, it does not announce itself with the violence that memory has prepared everyone for. The door is not struck, kicked, or splintered. There is no shouted command, no barked order carried on the authority of weapons and uniforms. Instead, there is restraint, so subtle it initially feels unreal. The knock, when it comes, lacks urgency. It is controlled, almost tentative, as if the hand delivering it is aware of the weight it carries and chooses not to add to it. For those inside the room, this difference is not immediately comforting. It is disorienting. Fear does not dissolve simply because the expected cruelty is delayed. The pause after the knock stretches unnaturally long. People glance at one another, searching for confirmation that they all heard the same thing. Years of occupation have taught them that deviation from the norm can be just as dangerous as conformity. A softer knock does not signal mercy, it signals uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a world governed by arbitrary power, can be fatal. No one moves at first. Muscles remain tense, bodies angled toward flight or compliance, minds racing through contingencies that no longer quite fit the moment unfolding. When the door opens, it does so without force. This detail matters more than it seems. Doors under occupation were rarely opened, they were breached. Entry was an act of dominance meant to be seen and felt. Here, the threshold is crossed without spectacle. The door swings inward on its hinges as it was designed to do, preserving the physical integrity of the home and, by extension, the dignity of those inside it. This alone is enough to destabilize the emotional equilibrium of the room. The figures who enter do not rush. They do not fan out aggressively or seize objects at random. Their movements are deliberate and contained. Authority is present, unmistakable, but it is not theatrical. There is no performance of terror. The room, which had been braced for chaos, instead receives order. This order, however, is not comforting in the conventional sense. It does not promise safety. It promises something unfamiliar, the possibility that power might operate without humiliation. For those watching, this restraint feels almost suspicious. Under previous regimes, restraint was a prelude to deception, a way to lull before striking. But nothing follows. No one is struck. No one is dragged forward by the collar. The people inside are acknowledged as occupants of the space rather than obstacles to be cleared. The very act of being seen without being immediately reduced to a target creates a psychological rupture. Fear, having nowhere to land, begins to fold inward on itself. This is where the moral reversal begins to take shape, not as a declaration but as an absence. The absence of brutality becomes the defining presence in the room. It forces those inside to confront a reality they have not rehearsed. Their bodies remain tense, their instincts still screaming danger, but the external cues no longer support those instincts. The room fills with a silence different from the one that preceded the knock. This is not the silence of anticipation. It is the silence of recalibration. Restraint, in this context, is not passive. It requires discipline. It requires an awareness of history and a conscious decision not to repeat it. The narrative lingers on this not to sanctify those who enter, but to underline that violence is often the easier path. Intimidation simplifies control. It bypasses complexity by reducing human beings to compliance or resistance. Choosing not to employ it introduces risk. It demands patience. It invites interpretation rather than submission. For the people inside the room, this choice is almost impossible to process in real time. Their memories resist it. They search for hidden meanings, for the inevitable turn where restraint gives way to force. But the moment holds. The expected escalation never arrives. Instead, the atmosphere shifts subtly, like pressure equalizing. Breathing becomes audible again. Small movements resume. Someone lowers their shoulders without realizing it. This chapter does not present restraint as kindness. It presents it as contrast. The power entering the room is still power. It still has the capacity to detain, to command, to alter lives irrevocably. But it exercises that power within boundaries. And boundaries, after years of limitless authority, feel revolutionary. The people inside are not asked to perform gratitude. They are not even asked to understand what is happening. They are simply not violated. The emotional impact of this moment lies precisely in its understatement. There is no catharsis, no immediate sense of relief. Trauma does not lift on command. Instead, there is confusion, followed by a tentative awareness that something fundamental has shifted. The rules that governed survival yesterday may no longer apply today. This realization is both liberating and frightening. When fear has been the organizing principle of life, its absence creates a void. The narrative emphasizes that this restraint does not erase the past. The memory of occupation remains present in every reaction, every hesitation. The people inside the room are not suddenly free in any meaningful psychological sense, but they are no longer being confirmed in their worst expectations. The cycle has been interrupted, if only for a moment. And interruption is how change begins. Outside the room, the broader machinery of war continues to grind forward. Front lines move, strategies shift, governments calculate. But inside this small space, history becomes intimate. The way power is exercised here will linger in memory long after the details blur. It will be recalled not as a victory or a defeat, but as a moment when the logic of domination failed to assert itself. This is the quiet center of the chapter. It asks the viewer to consider how deeply methods matter. Not just outcomes, but processes. Not just who holds authority, but how they choose to express it. The restraint shown here does not claim moral purity. It claims something more modest and more rare, the recognition that fear does not need to be reinforced to maintain control. As the scene settles, the room remains intact. Objects are where they were. Lives, though altered by the mere presence of authority, have not been shattered in the way they once would have been. This preservation, minimal as it may seem, carries enormous weight. It tells those inside that they have been encountered, not consumed. By the end of this chapter, the moral reversal is not yet fully articulated. It does not announce itself as a lesson. It exists as a sensation, an unresolved tension between what was expected and what occurred. The knock at dawn has happened, but it has not fulfilled its historical role. The script has been disrupted. And in that disruption, the room enters a silence that is no longer purely fearful, but uncertain in a way that allows something else, something not yet named, to begin forming. The silence that fills the room after the unexpected restraint hangs heavy. It is not a simple pause but a thick, oppressive stillness that presses against everyone present. The sound of breathing, once masked by anticipation, now becomes sharp and noticeable. There is no immediate relief, no sense of triumph or even understanding. Instead, there is a subtle unraveling of what had been ingrained in the very bones of those who had lived under the weight of occupation. The absence of the expected violence leaves space for something else, something more difficult to process: doubt. For those inside the room, there is a sudden awareness that they have just been subjected to something that does not fit the patterns they know. This is not liberation. Not yet. This is not a break from the past. But it is something different, something that cannot immediately be categorized. They had prepared themselves for force, for the unbearable certainty of subjugation that came with the knock at dawn. They had readied themselves for the old rhythms of oppression, for the sharp edges of power that threatened to cut through their lives again and again. But those rhythms never came. Instead, they were left suspended in the unfamiliar, not knowing what would follow. The air feels charged with the tension of the unknown, and as each moment drags on, the uncertainty begins to eat away at the very foundation of what they believed was true about power and authority. The immediate thought in many minds is that something is wrong. This is not how it is supposed to happen. Power is supposed to announce itself with finality, with the crushing weight of inevitability. It is supposed to take lives, to destroy futures, to make every moment a fearful act of compliance. But here, instead of dominating, power lingers, hesitates, and waits for something. The room becomes a space of cognitive dissonance, a place where every assumption is questioned, but no answers are readily available. This unsettling quiet pushes against the psychological walls built over years of occupation. The people inside the room, having lived for so long under the constant threat of violence, begin to realize something disturbing. Their own instincts have been so shaped by fear that they no longer know how to process an encounter where fear does not emerge as the dominant force. Their minds race to find a new framework, a new way of interpreting this event, but they are still tethered to the past, to the knowledge that when the door opens, something should be taken, something should be lost. The door is a doorway into uncertainty, and uncertainty is a form of discomfort that none of them are equipped to handle. They are frozen between the known and the unknown, their bodies still bracing for a blow that has not yet arrived. In this liminal space, where past trauma collides with an unprecedented present, the people inside must confront a crucial realization: their perceptions of authority, their relationship with power, have been entirely shaped by the violence of occupation. And now, without that violence, there is a gaping hole where certainty used to be. The world has been turned upside down in a way they cannot yet comprehend. Power has entered the room, but it has not spoken its usual language. It has not taken its usual form, and in doing so, it forces the room's occupants to confront something they never wanted to think about. What happens when the means of control are not exerted with cruelty, but with restraint? For those inside, the line between fear and hope becomes blurred. The room may have been preserved in its physical form, its furniture intact, its air still, but the emotional terrain is unsettled. The absence of violence does not bring peace. It is a quiet that trembles with the question of what will happen next. The room, previously a safe place to retreat from the ever-present threat outside, now feels like an interrogation chamber of its own. The discomfort of not knowing what will happen, of having no guide to what is right or wrong in this moment, threatens to overwhelm them. How can they trust this new reality when the old one was so thoroughly defined by the certainty of pain? As the minutes stretch on, the reality of restraint begins to sink in, not as a relief but as a challenge. Those in the room do not simply feel that they have avoided destruction. They feel that they are facing a different kind of challenge, one that does not require a heroism born of resistance, but one that demands a confrontation with their own assumptions about the world. The quiet here is not neutral. It carries with it the weight of survival, of years spent in constant vigilance, and it leaves no room for simple answers. The space of the room, which had once seemed secure, now becomes a microcosm of the broader world outside. What does it mean when authority refrains from asserting itself in the way it has always done? What does it mean when violence does not automatically follow the appearance of power? The emotional landscape of the room, previously shaped by fear and conformity, is now marked by uncertainty and disorientation. What has happened is not a release from the chains of oppression but a confrontation with the possibility that those chains might not be what they always appear to be. The real danger, it seems, is not the door opening, but the implications of what happens when it does not close them in the same way they had been closed before. For the people inside, there is no moment of catharsis, no emotional breakthrough. Instead, there is a slow, creeping realization that the world they have known, the world shaped by occupation, was always more fragile than they had imagined. The very systems that held them in place may not be as indomitable as they seemed. The sudden, sharp clarity of fear that had been the foundation of their lives is now replaced with something more complicated: doubt. It is the doubt of what happens when survival is no longer a matter of immediate compliance, but of navigating a new, unfamiliar power dynamic. The space between the knock at dawn and the entrance of power is stretched beyond any logical measure. It is a moment where the past and future collide in an impossible stasis. And in that stasis, the room's occupants must confront not just their fear, but their own complicity, their own internalization of violence. Fear had been their constant companion, and without it, they are left to wonder, who are they now, in this moment where the external force that shaped their lives has chosen not to act in the expected way? The room, which had once seemed so ordinary, now feels like a world unto itself. It is a space where history is being rewritten in real time. The actions that unfold within it cannot simply be understood in terms of what has happened before. They must be interpreted through a new lens, one that has not yet been fully constructed. The silence, the restraint, the hesitation, these are not just actions. They are invitations to reconsider everything. The room is both a sanctuary and a trap. It is the last place where old fears can find a home, and yet it is the only place where the possibility of a new future can begin to take root. And as the minutes pass, that uncertainty, once suffocating, begins to open up a space for something else. The faintest possibility that power, when it chooses not to exercise its will in the way it always has, might not be entirely corrupting. The space is small, but it is enough to cast doubt on everything the room's occupants have believed about their own subjugation. Power, they begin to understand, does not have to be synonymous with cruelty. It can exist without domination. And in that realization, in that moment of moral and emotional dislocation, the old world begins to lose its grip on them, just as they begin to lose their grip on the only reality they have ever known. As the hours pass and the unsettling stillness persists, the room transforms. It no longer feels simply like a space under occupation, but rather a space of possibility, a liminal space where history's assumptions are suddenly called into question. The authority that entered earlier, marked by restraint, by a deliberate absence of violence, now hangs over the room, a reminder of the fragile balance between control and surrender. The people inside have come to understand something more profound than mere fear. They have begun to see that power does not always have to manifest through force. Power can exist, function, and even prevail without resorting to violence, without the expected pattern of domination. But this realization, while significant, does not come with clarity or ease. Instead, it sits heavily, like a weight that cannot be easily shifted. It is neither liberating nor comforting, and it certainly does not answer the questions now swirling in their minds. In some ways, the emotional landscape of the room becomes even more complicated. There is no joy in the knowledge that restraint has been shown, no sense of relief to be found in the fact that nothing has been taken. The people inside are not offered the chance to escape their fate entirely, nor are they granted an absolution from the systems of power that have so thoroughly shaped their lives. They are left instead with a deeper, more unsettling realization that the world they have lived in, the world they have been trying to survive, is far more complex than they had imagined. It is not simply a world where power is wielded against them, it is a world where power can be exercised with great subtlety, where choices are made in ways they have never been taught to expect. This realization begins to unsettle their sense of justice. They had always believed that power operated along a clear, visible axis, one where those in authority were bound to reveal themselves in their cruelty, one where oppression was synonymous with violence, and where those who resisted were the heroes, the righteous few. But the reality before them is more nuanced. The authorities did not come with the whip of punishment in hand. They did not storm in demanding compliance. Instead, they entered with the quiet assurance of those who know they hold power, yet do not need to prove it in the traditional ways. They did not take. They did not demand. They simply waited. As the room settles further into this uncertain space, the people inside are forced to contend with the fundamental shift in power dynamics that has taken place. Restraint, once perceived as a rarity in the language of occupation, becomes the new currency of control. And in this, they face a challenge they were never prepared for. They had trained themselves to resist, to escape, to fight back when tyranny arrived. But now, with tyranny behaving differently, more subtly, more thoughtfully, they are unsure how to respond. The absence of violence should, in theory, signal the end of suffering, but in this case, it brings only more questions. Is restraint a mark of superiority? Or is it the sign of a new kind of control, one that does not rely on breaking the body, but instead breaks the spirit, reshapes the mind? As these questions bubble to the surface, a darker reality begins to emerge. The people in the room are not just being asked to survive, they are being asked to redefine what survival means in this new context. To live under occupation, under any regime, has always been an act of enduring. But enduring meant something clear: resisting, hiding, running, or even fighting back. The familiar language of occupation was one of obvious violence, one of raw action and overt danger. The new world they are facing, however, does not present itself with the clarity of brute force. It presents itself with subtlety, with patience, and with control over the small, quiet moments. This new world is one where survival is not measured in outright acts of resistance, but in quiet negotiations with the weight of power itself. And that is a much harder thing to fight. For those in the room, the challenge is not just about physical survival, but about the survival of their sense of self. It is the survival of their worldview, of the narratives they have constructed about power, about what it means to be oppressed, and about how to resist that oppression. These narratives are slowly being deconstructed by the quiet presence of authority, and that deconstruction is not liberating, it is disorienting. It is the destabilization of all they thought they knew, and in that destabilization, they begin to see just how fragile their sense of agency really is. Resisting the obvious violence of occupation was something they could grasp. It was something tangible, something they could define. But now, with power being exercised so differently, they are forced to question whether resistance itself is enough. What happens when you are not physically dominated, but mentally and emotionally controlled in a way that you cannot immediately perceive? What happens when the tools of oppression are not brute force, but patience and subtlety and the slow erosion of your will? As the day wears on, the people in the room begin to realize that their survival, while still important, is no longer the most pressing question. What matters now is what comes next, what this restraint actually means for their futures. If power can be exercised in this way, what are the limits of that power? And where, in this new landscape, can they find the space to reclaim their own autonomy? These questions churn in their minds as the silence continues. The authorities who have entered with such calculated care are not offering answers to these questions. Instead, they are forcing the people in the room to confront their own lack of answers, to confront the very foundation of their existence under occupation. The people inside begin to realize that they have been living in the shadow of a much larger system, one that cannot be resisted with the tactics they have known before. They cannot simply wait for this moment to pass. They cannot simply outlast it. They are being asked to adapt, to rethink their relationship with power, to accept that the terms of their survival have fundamentally shifted. At the same time, the people inside begin to understand that this restraint, this careful, deliberate approach, is not the same as an invitation to cooperation. They are not being given a choice. The authorities are not offering them a way out of occupation or a way to negotiate their freedom. What they are offering is a new form of control, one that is just as totalizing as violence, but one that operates in ways that are more difficult to fight against. The room fills with the realization that liberation, if it is to come, will not come in the way they had imagined it. There will be no liberating army sweeping through the door. There will be no sudden overthrow of the occupiers. Instead, liberation will come when they learn to recognize and resist this new form of control, this new exercise of power. This chapter, then, is not just about restraint. It is about the hard truth that restraint itself can be a weapon. It is about understanding that power does not always need to be wielded with violence to be effective. The people in the room are slowly coming to terms with the realization that the new form of occupation they face is not one defined by overt violence, but by a quiet, insidious control that shapes them from within. The true challenge now is to survive this quiet form of domination, to resist without the tools they had once relied on. It is a new kind of struggle, one that will not end when the knock at dawn stops. It will continue as long as the quiet power of restraint remains unchallenged. As the day stretches into the late hours, the room becomes a space of quiet reflection, though the people inside can no longer simply ignore the weight of the events that have unfolded. The silence, which had once seemed oppressive, now carries a more dangerous potential. It is not a silence of peace, nor one of comfort. It is the silence of uncertainty, of unknown possibilities that linger just beyond comprehension. No one has left. No one has been taken. Yet the feeling of being trapped in this new and unsettling reality intensifies. The absence of violence, which should have marked a moment of liberation, instead fills the room with a deeper sense of unease. It is as if the world outside has been erased, replaced by a space where power has found a different, more subtle way to assert itself. The room, which had been the sanctuary of safety, now feels like a cage, one without bars, but still confining. The knowledge that nothing has been taken does not soothe the fear of what is to come. In fact, it only deepens it. It is as if the people inside are suspended in a state of perpetual anticipation, their minds racing to predict the next moment, the next step. They had lived under the expectation that violence would arrive in the form they had always known. But now that violence has been replaced by something that feels equally potent, but far more insidious. The knock at dawn no longer signals the arrival of soldiers, but of an occupying force that does not need to wield a weapon to control its subjects. This is a new form of authority, one that is not based on fear alone, but on the subtle erosion of will. The knowledge that no one has been arrested, no one has been dragged away, and yet the power in the room remains palpable, makes the people inside question everything they had assumed about their lives, their resistance, and their survival. They had spent so long preparing themselves for the violence of occupation, for the sudden eruptions of authority that left no room for doubt, no room for interpretation. But now, in the quiet after the knock, they find themselves adrift, unable to categorize their experiences. The familiar rules have been rewritten. In the past, survival meant resisting authority's overt actions. But now that authority has chosen not to act in the ways they had expected, what does survival even mean? How can they fight a power that operates not through brutality, but through patience? How can they resist when the force that oppresses them does not make itself visible in ways they can fight back against? The room feels as if it is holding its breath, waiting for the next development that will finally release them from this tension. But with each passing moment, they realize that this waiting is not going to end in the way they imagined. The room's occupants begin to sense the deep psychological toll of living under this new form of control. They are no longer simply dealing with an occupying force. They are now confronting their own internalized fear. The constant tension, the readiness to act, to fight, to resist, these are all remnants of a world that no longer exists. In a strange way, they have become prisoners not just of the outside force that occupies their land, but of their own conditioned responses to that force. They had learned to expect oppression in a certain form, and now that form has been denied to them. What happens when a person is so trained to live in one way that when the rules change, they do not know how to adapt? What happens when survival becomes a question of navigating the space between what has always been and what is now taking shape? This is the paradox they must now face. They have survived the knock at dawn, but they have not been liberated. They are not free. They are simply in limbo, caught between a past defined by violence and a future that remains undefined. There is no clear enemy here, no distinct challenge to face. Instead, they are left with the subtle power of authority that refuses to assert itself in the usual ways. The people inside the room realize that survival, in this context, requires something different from what they had known. It requires an emotional resilience, a mental fortitude, that is far harder to come by than physical resistance ever was. The absence of violence does not bring an end to their oppression. It simply transforms it into something more difficult to understand and, therefore, harder to resist. The emotional weight of this new form of power is perhaps most acute when the silence begins to deepen. It is as if the very air in the room is charged with an unspoken presence, one that makes every movement, every sound, seem magnified. There are moments when the room's occupants feel as though they are being observed, though there is no one present to observe them. It is as though the force that occupies their world has become a constant, invisible pressure. Even when no one speaks, the feeling of being watched persists. Even when they try to act normally, the knowledge that they are not free, truly free, haunts their every action. They cannot relax. They cannot let their guard down. They are, in a way, more trapped now than they were before, when the violence of occupation at least had a clear and recognizable form. This realization begins to erode any sense of peace they had thought might come with the absence of violence. Without violence, there is no immediate enemy to fight. But there is also no immediate victory to be claimed. What they are left with is a lingering, gnawing awareness of how much power they have ceded without even realizing it. And this is perhaps the most insidious form of oppression, the kind that is invisible, that is not marked by bloodshed or injury but by the slow, methodical reshaping of the mind, of the will, of the heart. They begin to see that their captivity is not just physical. It is emotional, psychological, and intellectual. They are no longer fighting for survival in the traditional sense. They are fighting for something far more elusive, their sense of agency. The people in the room begin to question the very foundation of their survival. If they are not simply surviving, but being slowly reshaped, what does that mean for their future? How can they resist something that does not wear a uniform or carry a weapon? How can they fight a power that speaks in silence, that operates in the background, that refuses to be seen or touched, but which nonetheless exerts an iron grip on their lives? These are the questions that plague them as the hours drag on. The absence of violence leaves them no clearer about what comes next. They know they are not free, but they cannot yet understand how this new form of oppression will unfold. They are left to wonder whether they have simply exchanged one form of tyranny for another, one that may be even harder to combat because it does not show itself as a visible threat.